The morning Theodora Merritt buried her husband, the sky above the Wyoming territory turned a shade of gray so deep and absolute that it seemed the heavens themselves had decided to mourn alongside her. And not a single soul in the small valley town of Cartwell disputed that the world had lost something irreplaceable when Edgar Merritt's heart gave out on the 4th of September, 1882. Edgar had been 41 years old, a big-framed, sun-browned man who laughed too loudly at his own jokes and always smelled faintly of pine resin and tobacco. And Theodora had loved him with the uncomplicated devotion of a woman who had chosen well and known it. They had come west together from Ohio 12 years prior, full of the particular stubbornness that the frontier demanded, and they had built the Merritt homestead from nothing more than a land grant, 2 mules, and the kind of faith that does not ask for proof before proceeding. The house was sturdy now, the barn solid, the chicken coop patched and repatched so many times that it had become something of a conversation piece among the neighboring ranchers. Their land ran along the western edge of Cartwell Valley, backed by a ridge of lodgepole pines and watered by a creek that ran reliable 10 months of the year. What was not solid, what was not sturdy, was Theodora herself in those first raw weeks of October. She was 34 years old, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, with hands that had been calloused since her mid-20s and a spine that refused to curve no matter how heavy the weight pressing down on it. But grief is not a weight that settles onto the shoulders. It settles into the chest and changes the way a person breathes, and Theodora found herself standing in the middle of rooms she had lived in for years, blinking as though she had never seen them before, wondering how the walls could look so familiar when everything inside them had fundamentally changed. She had 2 children. Clara was 9 years old, solemn-eyed and practical, the kind of child who organized her shoes by the door and reminded her mother about the chickens when Theodora forgot. Henry was 7, a round-cheeked boy with Edgar's laugh, and a tendency to ask questions that required more philosophy than a frontier mother could produce before breakfast. They were good children, sturdy in the way their father had been, and they were watching their mother with the careful attention of young animals that understand something has shifted in the ecosystem, without knowing exactly what. The neighbor whose land bordered hers to the north was a man named Patrick Ralston, and Theodora had known him the way one knows a landmark steadily present, identifiable at a distance, not particularly thought about up close. He had arrived in Cartwell Valley 3 years before Edgar's death, purchasing the old Hendricks Ranch with what people in town speculated was a small inheritance and a lot of nerve. He ran cattle, a herd of modest size but excellent quality, and he employed 2 ranch hands year-round, men named Dooley and Cass, who were reliable if not especially talkative. Patrick was 37, tall in that particular Western way that suggested he had grown up doing work that shaped bone as well as muscle, with dark reddish-brown hair that had begun to silver faintly at the temples, and eyes the color of creek water in autumn, not quite green, not quite brown, something in between that changed depending on the light. Theodora and Edgar had shared occasional dinners with Patrick, had exchanged the ordinary, neighborly courtesies of men and women who live close enough to need each other during branding season or harsh weather. Theodora had always found him pleasant enough, reserved in the way that some men are not unfriendly but simply economical with themselves, as though they have learned to spend their warmth deliberately rather than carelessly. Edgar had liked him. That had always been enough. The morning after the funeral, Patrick Ralston rode over to the Merritt homestead on his big sorrel gelding, dismounted at the fence, removed his hat, and stood there until Theodora came to the door. He was holding a pot covered with a cloth. "Mrs. Merritt," he said, and his voice was quieter than she expected. "Dooley's wife sent over a venison stew. She would have come herself, but the baby is cutting teeth." Theodora took the pot. "Thank you," she said. "Please thank her for me." He nodded, turned the brim of his hat once in his hands, and said, If there is anything you need, wood, water, any work around the place that wants doing, I want you to send word." Theodora looked at him steadily. She had heard this offer 5 times already that day, from the Reverend, from her nearest neighbor to the south, from 2 women she barely knew from the church circle, and from Edgar's old partner in a horse trading venture that had never quite gotten off the ground. Every one of those offers had felt like a kindness wrapped around an assumption that she was already failing, already sinking, already in need of rescue. "That is very kind of you, Mr. Ralston," she said. "I will keep it in mind." He put his hat back on, nodded once, and rode home. What Theodora did not tell him, what she told no one, was that she already knew the winter ahead was going to be the hardest thing she had ever faced in her life, and that was saying something, because she had faced quite a few hard things. October in Wyoming is not a gentle month. It arrives with purpose, cutting through what remains of summer's warmth with a competence that borders on arrogance, and by mid-month the ground along the creek had begun to freeze at night. Theodora spent those early October weeks taking inventory with a ruthless honesty she had learned from Edgar, who had believed that a person's real courage was measured not in crisis, but in the quiet, unglamorous work of preparation. The root cellar was adequately stocked. She had put up preserves all summer with the grim determination of a woman who had some instinct that this year mattered more than others. The woodpile was less impressive. Edgar had been planning to take a week in early October to cut and split, and that week had never come. She filed this information away without panic. She had the axe. She had her arms. She had 2 children old enough to help stack. The cattle presented a more complex problem. Edgar had kept a small mixed herd, 8 cows, a bull, and 4 calves that had come in the spring, and Theodora knew cattle the way a person knows a language they learned secondhand. She could manage the basics. She understood winter feeding well enough. What she was less certain about was the fence line along the northern pasture, which Edgar had mentioned in August needed attention, and which she had not yet had the chance to assess. She put on her coat on the first dry Saturday in October and walked the fence line herself, Clara at her side, carrying a notebook in which Theodora dictated the locations of broken posts and sagging wire. There were 9 separate compromise sections across 300 yards of fence. She stood in the middle of the field and looked at her daughter's careful handwriting in the notebook and felt the first genuine cold touch of fear. Not panic. She was not built for panic, but the particular quiet fear of a person who can do the arithmetic and does not like the answer. She fixed what she could that week. She and Clara and Henry working together on the simpler repairs, resetting posts that had merely shifted, rewiring sections where the existing posts were still sound. The more serious damage, 3 posts that had rotted through at the base, and would need to be dug out and replaced before the ground froze solid. She calculated she could manage if she started immediately. She was in the middle of digging out the second rotted post, her shoulders burning, her breath clouding in the cold morning air when she heard hoofbeats on the road. Patrick Ralston appeared at the fence line on his sorrel, heading south toward town, and he slowed when he saw her. He looked at the post, at the ground around it, at her face, and then he touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, Mrs. Merritt," he said. "Mr. Ralston," she said, not stopping. He looked at the remaining damaged sections, easily visible from where he sat. She could see him calculating, the same way she had calculated, a man who understood land and fence, and Winter read the situation immediately. "Those posts need to come out before the first hard freeze," he said. "I know," she said. There was a pause. The horse shifted beneath him, blowing steam from its nostrils into the cold air. "I have 2 men and a post-hole digger at the ranch," he said. She straightened up, leaning on the fence post she'd just freed. She looked at him directly, and what she felt was something she couldn't quite name, not pride exactly, because pride would have been simpler. It was something more complicated, something that had to do with the particular position of a woman alone who has made a decision about what kind of alone she intends to be. "I appreciate that," she said. "I believe I can manage." He held her gaze for a moment, not challenging, not dismissive, simply looking the way a man looks when he is deciding whether to push or to let be. "All right," he said, and rode on toward town. She managed it. It took her 3 days, and she was so tired by the third evening that she sat down at the kitchen table after the children were in bed and put her head on her arms and simply breathed for a very long time. But the posts were in the ground, solid, and the wire was strung taut, and the northern pasture fence would hold. What she had not anticipated was the loneliness. That is not quite the right word, because Theodora was not constitutionally inclined toward loneliness. She had always been comfortable in her own company, had valued her own thoughts, had enjoyed the particular quietude of a winter evening with a book and a lamp. But this was different. This was the loneliness that arrives when you have spent 12 years sleeping next to the same person, and those nights are now empty, and the sounds of the house at night are different without someone else breathing in the dark. She did not speak of this to anyone. She wrote letters to her sister in Ohio, cheerful, practical letters about the children and the livestock and the weather. She sat with the other women after Sunday services and listened and spoke when spoken to, and was, by all observable accounts, managing. November arrived with a blizzard that lasted 3 days and buried the yard in snow past Henry's knees. Theodora spent those 3 days moving between the house and the barn in a line she had strung between them, a trick Edgar had taught her in their 3rd winter, after hearing stories of settlers who had gotten turned around in whiteout conditions between their own barn and house and frozen to death 20 yards from warmth. The line was already strung before the snow started because she had learned from Edgar, and she intended to go on learning from him even now that he was gone. She lost one calf. It was the smallest one, underdeveloped since birth, and she had known all summer that it was a risk. She found it on the 2nd morning of the blizzard, and she stood over it for a moment in the howling white and felt the grief of it, not just the financial loss, which mattered, but the particular grief of losing a small thing you had tried to keep. Then she went inside and made breakfast for her children. On the 4th day, when the snow had stopped and the sky had returned to the flat pale blue of a Wyoming winter morning, Patrick Ralston rode up to her gate. He was on the sorrel again, and behind him on a lead rope was a heavily loaded pack horse. Theodora came to the door and watched him from the porch. "I am going to leave these at your gate," he called, "because I suspect you will not let me bring them through. Firewood and 2 blocks of salt for your cattle and some cornmeal from the grain store that came in last week. I had them put Merritt on the order." She walked to the gate. She looked at the firewood, neatly split and bundled, and the salt blocks and the sack of cornmeal, and she felt something move in her chest that she was careful not to examine too closely. "Mr. Ralston," she said. "I know," he said. "You did not ask and you do not need it, but the wood is from my surplus and duly cut it in August, and it has been sitting, so you would be doing me a favor by taking it off my hands." She looked at him. He looked at her. The winter sun was bright off the snow, and she had to squint slightly. "How much cornmeal?" she said. 50 pounds. She was quiet for a moment. 50 pounds of cornmeal was not a small thing. It was also precisely what she was running low on and had been calculating how to stretch. "All right," she said. "The firewood I'll accept as the neighborly gesture it appears to be. The cornmeal I'll pay you back in the spring when I sell." He shook his head. "It's not a loan." "Then I cannot take it," she said. He looked at the sky, at the mountains, at his horse, in the way of a man exercising patience he did not fully feel. "Theodora," he said, and then stopped, as though the use of her given name had surprised him as much as it had surprised her. He started again. "Mrs. Merritt, the Andersons 2 valleys over are being helped by every hand in their county after the fire. Neighbors help neighbors out here. That's not charity, that's survival. I know the difference," she said quietly, "and I intend to remain on the right side of it." He left the firewood and the salt blocks. He took the cornmeal back with him. Theodora watched him ride away with the pack horse, and she stood there in the cold for a moment longer than she needed to, and then she went inside and started the noon meal. What she did not know, what she could not have seen from her doorway, was that Patrick Ralston rode back to his ranch and stood in the middle of his barn for a very long time, his hand on the neck of the sorrel, thinking about a woman who would not take 50 pounds of cornmeal and the particular kind of strength that looked, from the outside, almost exactly like stubbornness. December came hard. The cold in Wyoming in December of 1882 was the kind of cold that has an opinion about you, that makes itself known not just to your skin, but to your plans, your optimism, your belief that you have prepared adequately. Theodora's water pump froze twice, both times in the before-dawn hours when the temperature dropped to places that felt almost personal. She learned to bank the kitchen stove higher than she usually would have, and to move the indoor water barrel closer to the heat, and she woke twice each night to check the animals. Clara and Henry, bless them, had become useful in ways that would have made Edgar laugh and tear up simultaneously. Clara had taken over the chicken feeding entirely, counting the birds every morning with a seriousness that reminded Theodora of a tiny schoolteacher taking attendance. Henry had appointed himself the official wood carrier, small armload by small armload, keeping the wood box beside the stove perpetually topped up with the dedication of a boy who has decided this is his contribution to the household's survival and intends to be magnificent at it. At church on the Sundays when the road was passable, Theodora listened to the ordinary progress of the valley's winter news. The Dennison's old mare had died. The grain merchant in town had received a shipment that was half what had been expected. The new schoolteacher, a young woman from back east who had arrived in September full of pedagogical enthusiasm and floral print dresses, had been confined to the school during the blizzard for 2 days and had emerged changed in some fundamental way, her enthusiasm intact but her dresses replaced by more sensible wool. Patrick Ralston attended the same church, always in the same pew 3 rows from the back on the right side. He was always alone, and Theodora had wondered briefly, in the absent way one wonders about neighbors, whether there was a particular reason for that. She had heard, in the valley gossip that circulated as reliably as the creek, that he had been engaged to a woman back east before he came west, and that the engagement had ended before his departure, and that this was not something he discussed. She had not investigated further. People's private histories were their own. On the second Sunday of December, the sermon ran long, and the sky outside had begun the particular darkening that preceded snow. There was a general anxious rustling among the congregation, the collective mental calculation of distances and horses and wind direction, and when the Reverend finally concluded, the exit was more purposeful than usual. Theodora was helping Clara button her coat when she became aware of Patrick standing at the end of her pew. "The weather is turning," he said. "How far are your horses?" "I came in the wagon," she said. "The horses are at the livery," he nodded. "I'll ride with you as far as your turnoff." She opened her mouth to decline, and then she looked at the sky through the church window and thought of her children and made the practical decision. "Thank you," she said. They drove the wagon north together, Henry sitting between them on the bench, because Henry had decided that the tall, quiet man with the sorrel horse was interesting, and proximity was the best investigative strategy. Clara sat in the wagon bed, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sky with a scientist's attention to atmospheric detail. "Do you have animals?" Henry asked Patrick. "Cattle," Patrick said. "About 60 head. "That is a lot of cattle," Henry said with great seriousness. "It is a fair number," Patrick agreed, equally serious. "My father had 8 cows and a bull," Henry said, "and 4 calves, but one died in the blizzard." There was a brief quiet. Theodora kept her eyes on the road. "Your father built a fine ranch," Patrick said. "He was a good man." Henry considered this. "He was," he said. "He could whistle with 2 fingers. I am still learning." The snow began to fall softly before they reached the Merritt turnoff, fat flakes drifting rather than driving, and Theodora had the irrational thought that it was almost beautiful, This particular moment of winter with the snow just starting and the sky the color of pewter and the road ahead winding toward home through the bare cottonwoods. "Thank you for the escort," she said when she pulled the wagon to a stop at her lane. Patrick touched the brim of his hat. He looked at her for a moment, that direct Creekwater gaze that she was beginning to recognize as characteristic, as simply the way he looked when he meant something. "Have a safe evening, Mrs. Merritt," he said. "Likewise," she said, and clicked the horses forward. That evening, after the children were in bed and the snow had settled into a quiet, steady fall that she could hear against the windows, Theodora sat at the kitchen table and wrote in the small journal she kept not for anyone else to read but for herself, a practice she had begun after Edgar's death at the suggestion of the Reverend's wife, who had said that grief kept inside the mind tends to calcify, while grief written down at least has the chance to flow. She wrote about the day, about the sermon and the snow and Henry asking careful questions in his Henry way, and then she paused with the pen above the page and wrote one more line. She wrote, "I'm not sure I know how to need anything from anyone anymore, and I'm not sure if that is strength or if it is something else." She looked at the line for a moment, then closed the journal and went to bed. January of 1883 delivered itself with absolute conviction. The temperature dropped to levels that made the previous months feel nostalgic by comparison, and the wind off the mountains had the character of something that actively disliked human settlement. Theodora's fuel consumption increased, and she rationed carefully, keeping the bedroom doors closed during the day to concentrate the heat in the kitchen and the main room. The children did their lessons at the kitchen table, Clara reading ahead in her primer and Henry working on arithmetic, with an intermittent focus that Theodora supplemented with creative real-world problems. How many logs would keep the stove going for 6 hours? How many cups of flour were in a 20-pound sack? How many days until spring if spring came on the 20th of March? The cattle were surviving. This surprised her somewhat, because she had not been entirely confident they would. She had supplemented their winter grazing with the hay she had put up less than Edgar would have had, but sufficient, and the salt blocks Patrick had left at her gate, which she had not been able to refuse because they were already there when she had made her decision about the cornmeal, and practically required her accepting them or rolling them back to his property, which would have been ridiculous. The cattle liked the salt. The cattle were, for cattle, doing reasonably well. One morning in the second week of January, she was in the barn doing the morning feeding when the barn door opened and Patrick Ralston walked in, stamping snow from his boots. She turned from the hay with the same expression she would have turned with from anything steady and unsurprised, which was a face she had cultivated because it was useful. "I knocked at the house," he said. "The children told me you were here." "They let you in," she said, which was both a question and a slight query about the state of her children's judgment. "Clara asked me to remove my boots and Henry offered me a biscuit," he said. "I removed my boots. I declined the biscuit." She returned to the hay. "What can I do for you, Mr. Ralston?" He was quiet for a moment, moving to the side of the stall in a way that was not threatening and not presumptuous but simply present. "I had Cass ride the fence line between our properties yesterday," he said. "Your north fence is holding well. Whatever you did in October was solid work." She glanced at him. "Thank you. I also noticed," he continued, "that your hay supply is lower than it should be for this time of year." She said nothing. "I have a surplus," he said. "Bought more than I needed at summer's end. It's sitting in the barn and Dooley's been complaining about navigating around it." "Dooley navigates around whatever is in his path," she said. "I imagine." "He does," Patrick said, with the brief, genuine quality of a man who is almost smiling. "But the fact remains. I have excess hay that I do not need and you have a hay supply that is running low. This is arithmetic, not charity." Theodora stopped working. She turned and looked at him fully, the way she rarely looked at people, the way she had looked at Edgar when she was deciding something. "What is your price?" she said. He blinked. This, apparently, was not what he had expected. "I told you I have a surplus. Everything has a price, Mr. Ralston. What is yours?" "Spring rate, we can settle in April when the market sets." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind those creek-water eyes that she couldn't precisely read. Then he named a figure, a fair one, below market, and they both knew it, but within the range of what could be argued as reasonable if either of them ever had cause to argue it. "Done," she said, and held out her hand. He shook it. His hand was warm, even in the cold of the barn, and his grip was the grip of a man who shook hands with women the same way he shook hands with men, without the hesitation or excessive gentleness that some men produced when confronted with female competence. She noticed this. He had duly and cast deliver 6 bales that afternoon on the ranch's large sled, and they stacked it neatly in her barn under her direction. And when they were done, she gave them each a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove, and they stood in her kitchen drinking it, big weathered men in their heavy coats, very careful not to track snow past the doormat. She paid attention to things like this: the way Patrick's men carried themselves, the small courtesies they extended. A man's workers, Edgar had always said, tell you more about him than he will ever tell you himself. February was what February always is in Wyoming, an endurance. The days began to lengthen almost imperceptibly, just enough to tease at the possibility of something better without delivering it, and Theodora spent those weeks doing the indoor work she had been putting off, repairing clothing, mending the leather harness that needed attention, teaching Clara to darn stockings and teaching Henry to sew on a button, which he found both humiliating and completely fascinating. She had been receiving, throughout the winter, small notes from Patrick Ralston. Not love letters, nothing of the sort. They were practical communications written in a clean, economical hand. Notes such as, weather service out of Cheyenne is forecasting heavy snow in the Northern Territories next week, likely to reach the valley. Dooley will be running a supply sled to town on Thursday if you have need of anything from the merchant. Or, the Larkspur Creek ford has been reported passable again as of this morning if your route south requires it. She read each one and filed it. She wrote back with the same practicality. Thank you for the forecast notice. She had written back regarding the supply sled with a list of 3 items she needed from the merchant, and the exact coin for each, which she had sent in a small envelope clipped to her reply. What she noticed was that his notes always contained useful information, never anything that presumed, never anything that required her to feel grateful beyond the simple, ordinary gratitude of neighbors exchanging intelligence. She found this, and she was careful about the word, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. She found this considerate. She found that she was beginning to look forward to the notes in a way that she was not entirely prepared to examine. On the 3rd Sunday of February, after services, the Reverend's wife, a warm-hearted and thoroughly unsuppressible woman named Martha Gaines, invited Theodora to stay for the women's sewing circle that met in the church hall after the main congregation had dispersed. Theodora almost refused. She had the particular grief-year instinct to avoid social situations that might require her to perform emotional states she was not feeling. But Clara wanted to stay, because the Reverend had a daughter Clara's age, and so Theodora stayed. She sat in the circle of women with her mending, and she listened. The conversation moved with the particular free flow of a group of women without men present, more honest, more varied, more willing to name things directly. Someone mentioned the upcoming spring cattle market. Someone else mentioned the new land claim being contested in the county seat. The Reverend's wife mentioned the Anderson family's fire recovery, and then, with the gentle purposefulness of a woman who likes to organize the world's information, she said, "Patrick Ralston has been very good to folks in the valley this winter." Theodora kept her eyes on her needle. "He has," said one of the older women, a rancher's wife named Hazel Drummond who had been in the valley since before anyone had thought to name it. "He brought the Kennedys enough wood to last them till March. Did not say a word about it, just had it delivered." "He is a quiet man," said another woman, "but not a closed one. There is a difference." "He has had a difficult history," Martha Gaines said, with the diplomatic vagueness that meant she knew more than she was going to share. but he has settled well here." Theodora said nothing. She sewed her seam and looked at the pale February light through the church windows, and thought about a man who delivered wood without talking about it and wrote notes full of useful information, and shook a woman's hand the same way he shook a man's and had. She was fairly certain, noticed the state of her hay supply in January, and found a way to make it all right without making her feel anything but transacted with. She rode home with the children in a thoughtful silence that Clara attributed to the cold and Henry to the interesting mathematical challenge of calculating how many buttons were on everyone's coat in the church hall. March arrived in the way March arrives in Wyoming, not with any real promise of spring, but with a slight change in the quality of the cold, a slightly different angle of the light, a suggestion that the world had not entirely forgotten what warmth felt like. Theodora felt it in her bones, the way ranchers and homesteaders feel seasonal shifts, not as a romantic sentiment, but as a physical fact, as real as the ground pressure changing under the snow. The cattle were not only surviving, they were in better condition than she had expected, owing partly to her careful management and partly to the hay she had purchased from Patrick, and partly to what she could only describe as the bloody-minded determination of the cows themselves, who seemed to have decided collectively that they were going to make it through and had applied themselves to the project. On a cold, bright morning in the first week of March, Theodora was in the barn repairing the leather traces on her wagon harness, a job that required patience and a sharp awl and a leather needle that did not want to cooperate, when she heard the sound she had been dreading all winter. It was a sound from deep inside one of the cows, the particular low, struggling sound that means a birth is happening and something is not right about it. She was with the cow in 30 seconds. She could see the problem immediately. The calf was positioned badly, one leg folded wrong, and the cow had been working at this for longer than was good for either of them. She rolled up her sleeves in the cold and did what had to be done, guiding and turning with hands that knew this work, had learned it from Edgar, who had learned it from his father, and 20 long, difficult minutes later, there was a wet and furious little calf on the barn floor making the particular noise of something that has arrived in the world and wants everyone to know it. She sat back on her heels in the straw and breathed. Her arms were shaking slightly, more from relief than exertion. The calf was up on uncertain legs within minutes, doing the immediate instinctual investigation of the world that calves always do, and the cow was calm, and everything was all right. It was only then that she realized Patrick Ralston was standing in the open barn door. She looked at him. He was looking at the calf with an expression she had not seen on him before, unguarded, something quiet and pleased and very genuine. "How long have you been standing there?" she said. "Long enough," he said. "That was well done." She stood up, brushing straw from her knees. She was a mess straw in her hair and blood on her sleeves, and her face flushed from the cold and the effort, and she was struck by the sudden acute awareness of this in a way that surprised her, because she was not generally a woman who was struck by how she looked. "I was passing," he said. "Saw the barn door open, thought I would check." "Everything is fine," she said. "I can see that," he said. He looked at her then, not at the calf, and the look was different. She was not imagining it. It was the same direct look he always had, but there was something more in it, something careful and warm and contained, the way a man looks when he is feeling something he has decided not to say. She looked away first. "I'll need to let her settle," she said. "The birth was hard on her." "Of course," he said. He moved to the door, paused. "Mrs. Merritt," she looked at him. "I am glad you are all right," he said. She held very still. "I am always all right," she said. He almost smiled. She could see it at the edge of his mouth. "Yes," he said. "I have noticed." He left. She stood in the barn with the cow and the new calf and the smell of hay and livestock and winter, and she put both hands flat against the stall boards and breathed, and she thought about a man who had stood in her barn door and watched her work and called it well done, and she thought about the way he had said he was glad she was all right with a quietness that made the words heavier than they would have been spoken any louder. She did not think about it again. She was very careful not to think about it again, for approximately 3 days, after which she stopped being careful and simply let herself think about it because she was, among her other qualities, a practical woman, and it is not practical to spend energy on suppression when the thing you are suppressing is already in the room. What she thought when she let herself think was this: she had learned something this winter. She had learned how to be alone in the way she had wanted to be alone. Not helplessly, not desperately, not reaching for assistance the moment difficulty arrived, but competently and quietly and on her own terms. She had learned to hold the homestead together with her children beside her and the land cooperating most of the time and her own 2 hands making up the difference. She had learned that she was capable of a great deal more than she had known, and that this knowledge was worth the price she had paid for it, even though the price had been steep. And she had also learned, and this part she had not expected, that there was a difference between needing someone and wanting someone, that these were not the same territory at all. That a person could be fully capable of standing alone and still find that there was a man who made a barn doorway feel different, a man whose notes she looked forward to, a man who shook her hand like a person and watched her work and meant it when he said she had done it well. The distinction mattered to her. It mattered enormously. Spring came to the valley in the 2nd week of April like a promise finally kept, all at once and undeniably. The snow retreating from the lower pastures and the creek running high and cold, and the willows along the bank going from gray to the first faint, impossible yellow-green that is the most hopeful color in the natural world. The cattle came out of their winter endurance with the enthusiasm of survivors, which they were, spreading across the lower pasture with a sense of occasion. The valley woke up. The road to town, which had been navigable but grim all winter, became actually pleasant in the warm afternoons, and there was the ordinary spring activity of fencing repair and plowing, and the social reemergence of people who had been essentially isolated and now wanted to be among other human beings with some urgency. Theodora was planting the kitchen garden when Patrick Ralston rode up her lane on a morning when the sky was the particular deep blue of Wyoming spring, and the air smelled of mud and new grass. He dismounted, tied the sorrel to the gate post, and walked across the yard to where she was on her knees in the dirt. She had been expecting something. Not this specifically, but something. The winter had built towards something. She could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives. He crouched down beside her, which was an interesting choice. He could have stood, which would have made him above her, or he could have sat, which would have been casual. Crouching put them at approximately equal height and felt, she thought, like a careful decision. "The winter is over," he said. "It is," she agreed. "You made it through," he said. "I did," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The dirt was good spring dirt, dark and crumbling, and she worked it with her fingers while he found what he wanted to say. "I have been trying to think of how to ask you something," he said, "and I have not been able to find a way that does not seem like I am questioning your judgment or overstepping a line." She looked at him. "Ask," she said. He met her gaze. "Why did you not ask me for anything this winter?" There it was, directly and plainly, without decoration. She sat back on her heels and looked at the kitchen garden and the house beyond it and the sky above it. And she thought about how to answer honestly, which was the only kind of answer she gave. "'Cause," she said, "I was still learning." He was quiet. She could feel him thinking, and she let him. "Learning what?" he said finally. "Whether I could," she said. "Whether I was the kind of person who could do this. Keep this place, keep the children, keep the cattle and the fences and the firewood and all of it, whether it was possible or whether Edgar had been the thing making it possible and without him I was not enough." She said this without drama, which made it heavier than drama would have. "And," he said. "And I am," she said. "Enough. I found out that I am." He was looking at her with an expression she had never quite seen on him before, something open and earnest and very, very warm. And she understood in that moment that this man had spent an entire winter watching from a careful distance, sending notes full of useful information and surplus hay at negotiated prices and salt blocks that were already there before she could refuse them, watching her make herself into what she already was. and that he had understood the whole time what she was doing and why. "That is the most important thing a person can learn," he said quietly. "I know," she said, "and I know that you knew it, that you let me learn it." He said nothing. But there was something in the way he held still, the particular stillness of a man who is hearing something that matters. "The cornmeal," she said. "You remember," he said. "I think about it," she said. "You took it back. You could have left it and made an argument, and I would have run out of arguments eventually, but you took it back. You needed to refuse it," he said simply, "so you could find out you didn't actually need it." She looked at him for a long moment. The spring sun was warm on her back, and the dirt was warm under her hands, and the sorrel at the gate was investigating the fence post with a methodical curiosity. "You are an unusual man, Mr. Ralston," she said. "Patrick," he said, "I think we have earned that." She almost smiled, almost. "Patrick," she said. The name sat comfortably in her mouth, which surprised her slightly. She had a feeling it was going to go on sitting there. "I would like to ask you something else," he said, "and this time I am not going to find a way around asking it." "Then ask," she said. "Would you have dinner with me?" he said. "Not here, not a neighborly occasion, in town at the hotel dining room. Would you have dinner with me as a man who admires you considerably, and would very much like the chance to tell you so in a context that is not your barn or your fence line or your kitchen doorway?" The spring air moved between them, carrying the smell of the creek and the new grass and the particular opening up quality of a world after winter. Theodora Merritt had spent the winter becoming certain of who she was. She knew, sitting in her kitchen garden with mud on her hands, and a man she had learned to look for on a sorrel horse watching her with quiet, earnest eyes, that she was not going to become less of herself for wanting something. She had learned that too. That wanting was not weakness. That a woman fully capable of standing alone could also choose, without any contradiction, to reach towards something. "Yes," she said, "I will." The evening was set for the following Saturday. Theodora wore her best dress, gray wool with blue trim, sensible but not without its own opinion about aesthetics, and drove the wagon to town while Clara and Henry stayed with Hazel Drummond, who had offered with an enthusiasm that suggested the valley gossip had been doing its work. Patrick was waiting at the hotel in his good coat, hat in hand, and the look on his face when she walked across the lobby toward him was the look of a man for whom the sight of this particular woman has been quietly rearranging his interior landscape all winter. The dining room of the Cartwell Hotel was not glamorous by any standard a city might apply, but it was warm and lit with good lamp oil, and the food was honest and well prepared, and they sat across a small table from each other in the early April evening and talked. They talked the way people talk when they have been waiting to properly talk, at first carefully, finding the edges of things, and then with increasing ease, one subject leading naturally to the next. He told her about Ohio, about coming west, about the decision he had made after the engagement ended. He named it plainly, without excessive pain, as a thing that had happened and taught him something and closed, and about what he had been looking for in the territory and whether he thought he had found it. She told him about Edgar, honestly and with love, because Edgar deserved honesty and love, and she was not going to diminish him for anyone's comfort. She told him about the 12 years they had built together and what she had lost, and what she had kept, and what the winter had taught her. She talked about her children with the particular unself-conscious pride of a mother who knows her children clearly and likes what she sees. He listened. She noticed, as she had been noticing all winter, that he listened the way people listen when they actually want to know, not waiting for a break in the speech to insert himself, but genuinely attending to the words. "Clara is remarkable," he said, when she had finished talking about her daughter. "She had 3 questions for me about the cattle business the one time I came to the house. Very specific questions. She should come see the ranch." Theodora raised an eyebrow. "And Henry?" "Henry gave me an extremely thorough biscuit evaluation," Patrick said, and this time he did smile fully, and it changed his face the way she had suspected it would. Opened it up, made it younger, made the gray at his temples look like distinction rather than age. He has strong opinions about lard ratios. He does, Theodora said. He gets it from his father. And she smiled too, because Edgar's opinions about biscuits had been legendary in the county, and it was all right. It was more than all right to smile about that. After dinner, they walked along the main street of Cartwell in the spring evening, the last of the daylight going gold at the western edge of the sky over the mountains, the street mostly quiet at this hour, a few horses at the rail outside the saloon, and a lamp burning in the back of the dry goods store where the owner liked to do his accounting after hours. They walked with a foot of space between them, appropriate, and the space felt comfortable rather than vast, a considered distance rather than an uncertain one. "I should take you home," he said, when they had completed the length of the street and returned to the hotel where her wagon was tied. "You do not need to ride out," she said. "I know," he said. "I would like to." She looked at him in the last of the evening light, this man who had spent a winter being exactly what she needed without ever asking her to acknowledge needing it, and she felt the thing she had been carefully tending since March break open into something recognizable and true. "All right," she said. He rode beside the wagon on the sorrel in the mild April darkness, and they talked easily across the space between them. About the spring planting, about the cattle market in June, about the schoolteacher who had survived her blizzard and was now, by all accounts, planning to stay. When they reached the Merritt lane, he rode with her to the gate and dismounted. "Thank you," she said, still on the wagon bench. "Thank you," he said. She looked down at him. The moon was up, a fat spring moon that made everything pale and clear, and she could see his face perfectly. "Patrick," she said, and the name was easy now, was already hers to use. "Why did you watch all winter? Why did you let me manage without you when you could see, I know you could see, when it was difficult?" He held the sorrel's lead rope and looked up at her with the steady openness she had come to understand as his fundamental quality. "Because you were doing the most important work a person can do," he said. "Finding out what you are made of. I didn't have the right to interrupt that." She was quiet for a moment. The creek ran somewhere in the dark, high with snowmelt. "You sent the notes," she said. "Information," he said, "not assistance. There is a difference." "Yes," she said softly, "there is." She climbed down from the wagon, which she did not need help with and he did not offer. She stood on the ground beside him, and they were close now, close enough that the spring air between them was warm, and she looked at him with the same directness he had always offered her. "Come to Sunday dinner," she said, "this week. Bring Dooley and Cass if they haven't got plans. Clara has been wanting to ask more cattle questions, and Henry will evaluate the biscuits, and She stopped. She started again. "I would like you to come." The openness in his face reached his eyes, and she saw clearly that this man, this reserved and careful man who had spent a winter being thoughtful and quiet and respectful of her independence, was genuinely, deeply, almost undisguisably happy. "We will be there," he said. Sunday dinner was, by any measure, a success. Dooley had the social intelligence to arrive with compliments about everything, and Cass had the social intelligence to be very quiet and helpful. And Clara asked her cattle questions with the precision of a small attorney, while Patrick answered them with the seriousness they deserved. Henry evaluated the biscuits and delivered a solemn verdict that they were among the finest he had encountered, which Theodora had made that morning with a concentration she was willing to admit to herself, was in part about impressing a man who had once been offered and declined a biscuit from her kitchen. After dinner, Dooley and Cass excused themselves with appropriate tact, taking themselves out to look at the barn, and Clara took Henry to the side yard to demonstrate a knot she had been practicing, and Theodora and Patrick sat on the porch in the mild Sunday afternoon. "You are good with them," she said. "They are easy to be good with," he said. "They are interesting." She turned to look at him. The spring afternoon lay across the valley in long, warm bands, and the creek was audible from here, and the lower pasture was going brilliantly green. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask," he said, giving her own word back to her. "What do you want?" she said. "Not from me specifically." "In general, What is it you are building out here? He thought about this, genuinely, not offering the easy answer. A life that is actually mine, he said. Out east, I was building the life I was supposed to want. The woman I was engaged to was the right woman by every social measurement, and I felt nothing like what I should have felt, and I thought there was something wrong with me. When I came out here, he paused. When I came out here, I started to understand that what I had been missing was not the right measurement, that I was measuring by the wrong things. What are the right things? She said. He looked at her. This, he said, what you and Edgar built. Land that is yours and work that is real and people who are honest with you and with themselves. She absorbed this. And what else? She said, because she felt there was more. He was quiet for a long moment. The porch boards creaked slightly under his boots as he shifted. Someone to build it with, he said. Someone who doesn't need me to exist, but who might over time want me alongside. The afternoon moved between them, warm and unhurried. Theodora looked at the mountains to the west, the peaks still white, the middle slopes just showing the dark beginning of the spring green, and she thought about 12 years of partnership with Edgar, the kind of partnership where two people become so interlaced that you cannot tell which part of what you built belongs to whom. She thought about the winter she had just survived and what it had cost and what it had given her. She thought about a man who had taken back 50 pounds of cornmeal so she could find out she didn't actually need it. I have not been a widow long enough, she said carefully, to know exactly where I stand with everything. I know, he said, and she could hear in his voice that he did know, not performing patience, not strategically waiting, but genuinely accepting the reality of the situation with the steadiness that was so characteristic of him it had started to feel like weather to her, a given condition of the atmosphere. But I am standing, she said, which is what I needed to know. Yes, he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. Clara laughed at something in the side yard, and Henry made a noise of protest that suggested she had demonstrated the not too successfully, and he was now entangled. Don't rush me, she said. I will get where I am going at my own pace. Something shifted in his expression, warm and steady and entirely, completely genuine. Theodora, he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like it belonged there. I will wait every minute you require. Spring deepened into May and May into June, and the valley took on the particular lush abundance of a Wyoming summer in full progress, the pastures green and heavy, the creek running clear, the sky a blue so dense and complete it seemed almost architectural. The cattle market in mid-June went well. Patrick helped her drive her small herd to the market yard in town, not because she asked, but because he was driving his own herd on the same day and it was practical, and Theodora accepted this the way she had learned to accept things from him, as the simple truth of what it was, without inflating it into debt or deflating it into nothing. She received a fair price for her cattle. She repaid him the hay debt before the market was an hour finished, counting out the coin with the same steadiness with which she had managed everything all winter, and he accepted it without ceremony, which was precisely right. What was changing between them was changing the way seasons change, not in an instant, not dramatically, but pervasively, so that you could not point to the moment of shift, only to the fact that the shift had occurred and the landscape looked different now than it had. He came to Sunday dinner most weeks. He brought the children small, thoughtful things, a geography book he had ordered from Cheyenne for Clara, who received it with an expression of absolute reverence, and for Henry, a proper penknife of the appropriate size for a 7-year-old that Theodora inspected and approved before he was permitted to use it. He asked Henry to help him with small tasks around the barn when he came by on weekdays, not as a charity gesture, but as a genuine request from a man who needed a small assistant for small tasks, and Henry went with the seriousness of someone who has been entrusted with something real. Clara, who was 9 years old and therefore significantly wiser about human nature than anyone gave her credit for, said to her mother one evening while they were doing the dishes, "Mr. Ralston looks at you the way Papa used to look at you." Theodora continued washing the dish she was washing. "Does he?" she said. Yes, Clara said. It's the same kind of looking. I noticed. You notice a great deal, Theodora said. I do, Clara agreed without any false modesty. Do you look at him back? Theodora was quiet for a moment. Clara, she said. I think you should, Clara said, in the tone of someone closing a conversation they have conducted to their satisfaction. Papa would think so too. Theodora stood at the sink with the wash water cooling around her wrists and looked at the window, dark now with the summer evening, her own reflection faint in the glass. Clara was right. Edgar would have thought so. Edgar had been the most generous person she had ever known, generous in ways that were not always comfortable because they precluded smallness, and he would have looked at this situation, a good man being careful and honest and patient, her children responding to him, her own heart finding its way toward something, and he would have said, in the blunt affectionate way he had, Thea, you are allowed. She said to her own reflection, I know. July in Cartwell Valley was a community event. There was a town social on the 4th, the annual celebration with its tables of food and its fiddle music, and its dancing on the platform they built in the field behind the church every year for the purpose, strung with lanterns that swayed in the evening breeze and turned everyone's faces warm gold. Children ran at the edges of the light with the particular wild energy of summer nights, and the adults moved between conversation and food and the comfortable ritual of community. Theodora went with her children and found herself standing with Hazel Drummond and Martha Gaines drinking lemonade and watching the dancers. And then Patrick appeared at her elbow with a second cup of lemonade that he presented without comment. And Martha Gaines made an expression of such transparent delight that it was essentially a theatrical performance. They watched the dancing for a while, standing close but not touching, talking with the easy fluency they had developed over months, and then the fiddle moved into a waltz, and the dancing floor rearranged itself into couples, and Patrick turned toward her. Theodora, he said. If you are going to ask me to dance, she said, the answer is yes. He smiled fully, the way she had come to wait for without admitting she was waiting, and offered his hand. She took it. He was a good dancer, which she had not predicted and which pleased her in the irrational way that unexpected competences please. They moved around the platform in the lantern light, and his hand was warm at her waist and her hand in his was steady, and she was aware of everything, the summer night and the fiddle music and the smell of grass and lamp oil, and the way he was looking at her, with the particular vividness of a person who has decided to be present in their own life. I have been meaning to say something, he said, as they moved through a turn. Then say it, she said. I love you, he said, directly, without performance, without strategic delay. I have been in love with you since approximately November, when you told me you could not take the cornmeal and you held your ground in the snow with your chin up, and I understood that I had never met anyone quite like you in my life. I did not say it sooner because you needed the space, and I was trying very hard to respect that. But I think it should be said. She looked at him in the lantern light, this man, this particular patient, honest man who had watched her all winter and understood what she was doing and let her do it and brought hay at a fair negotiated price and sent notes full of weather intelligence, and she felt it in full, the thing she had been learning all spring, clear and certain in hers. I love you, she said. And then, because she was Theodora Merritt and always had been, I have been finding my way to saying that for about 3 months. He laughed. She had not heard him laugh out loud before, a real, full, unguarded laugh, and it was, she discovered, the best thing she had heard in a very long time. She laughed too, right there on the dancing platform under the lanterns in the middle of July in Cartwell Valley, and he held her hand tighter and they went around the platform again in the summer night, and it was, by any honest reckoning, perfect. The summer progressed with the richness of a summer that knows it is watched and appreciated. Theodora's kitchen garden produced in abundance. She had always been an excellent gardener, but this year the garden felt like collaboration, the earth cooperating with her intentions in a way that felt almost personal. She put up preserves with Clara's help, teaching her daughter the process with the same methodical patience her own mother had used, explaining not just the steps but the reasons behind each one, because Clara was a girl who needed to understand the why in order to trust the how. Patrick came most evenings now, arriving in the golden late daylight and staying for dinner and sitting on the porch afterward, while the children wound down toward sleep. And the conversations they had in those porch evenings were the kind of conversations that build something, not always about anything grand, often about ordinary things, but conducted between two people who had decided to know each other fully and were working their way steadily toward that. He talked about his family in Pennsylvania, his father, who had died when Patrick was 22, leaving him a modest inheritance and a strong opinion about hard work. His mother, who was still alive and wrote letters that were, he said, masterpieces of compressed information. Two sisters, both married, both in the East, both puzzled by his decision to go west but supportive in the way of women who have always known they could not hold their brother. She talked about her parents, her sister who wrote from Ohio, the life she had left and the life she had built and the understanding she had reached, somewhere in the middle of this year, that she was not homesick for Ohio anymore, that this valley and this land and this particular view of the mountains to the west was home in the specific way that a place is home when you have bled for it. On an August evening when the air was still warm at 9 o'clock and the fireflies were improbably beautiful in the pasture, and the children had finally surrendered to sleep, Patrick and Theodora sat on the porch steps instead of the chairs. She wasn't sure how that happened, only that it was natural, and she leaned into him, which was also natural, and his arm came around her in a way that was neither sudden nor uncertain. "I have been thinking," he said into the warm dark. "About what?" she said. "About the winter," he said. "About next winter, about whether you intend to manage it alone again." She could feel the careful way he was approaching this, the way he always approached things that mattered, not forcing, not demanding, but finding his way toward honest speech. "I have not decided," she said. "I know that I can. What I am thinking about now is different." "What are you thinking about?" he said. She was quiet, listening to the creek and the summer insects and the horse in the pasture, and she thought about how to say what she was thinking. "I am thinking," she said, "about what it would look like to build something again, not to replace what I had, not to have someone to manage things for me, because I have learned this year that I do not need that, but to build something new with someone who understands that I am a person who needs to stand in my own place and who would stand in his place, and we would choose to stand near each other." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is exactly what I want." She looked at the fireflies in the pasture, their small cold lights moving through the summer dark, and she thought about Clara and Henry and a man who gave Clara geography books and let Henry feel genuinely useful and took back cornmeal so a widow could find out she didn't need it. "I think," she said, "that I am almost there." "Take your time," he said. "I am not going to take too much more time," she said. "I just want to say it right." He pressed his lips to her hair briefly, the first time he had done that, and it was quiet and sure and exactly the right thing. She closed her eyes. September brought the anniversary. It arrived quietly, as significant dates always do, making no announcement, simply appearing in the calendar with all of its weight intact. Theodora spent the morning of the 4th of September at the church cemetery alone, which was how she needed it. She stood at Edgar's grave in the early autumn air, the hills around her going gold and russet at the higher elevations, and she talked to him the way she had talked to him all year, not the formal speech of grief, but the ordinary conversation of a person telling someone who mattered what was happening. She told him about the winter, all of it, the fence posts and the calf born in the blizzard and the hay at a negotiated price. She told him that Clara had read the geography book twice, and Henry could now whittle a passable whistle with his penknife. She told him that the north fence still held. She told him that she was all right genuinely, specifically all right, not the performance of all right she had been giving the world since October of the previous year, but the actual condition of it, hard one and real. And then she told him about Patrick Ralston, because Edgar deserved to know. She told him about the cornmeal and the notes and the waltz in the July lantern light and the arm around her on the August porch steps, and she told him. She said this quietly, to the stone and the sky, and to Edgar wherever he was, that she was going to be happy again. That she was not going to apologize for it and she was not going to diminish it, because that would have been exactly the kind of smallness Edgar had never permitted in himself or in her. "You would like him," she said. "He is quiet and he shakes hands properly and he listens like he means it. He is not you. Nothing will ever be what you were, but he is himself, and that is something." She stayed a while longer in the morning quiet, and then she drove home. And by the time she reached the lane, the particular acute quality of the grief had settled back into the place where she carried it. Not gone, never entirely gone, but no longer so sharp that it cut when she moved. Patrick came that afternoon, not having been told about the date. She had not told him, but having apparently understood by some instinct of his own. He brought a jar of honey from a farm sale in town, and a loaf of bread his neighbor's wife had sent, and he sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and talked with Henry about the progress of the Whistle project, and did not ask Theodora a single question about how she was, because he could see how she was, and what she was a woman who had done something hard today and done it well. She loved him for this. She loved him for many things, but this particular understanding of when to speak and when not to, of what she needed without being asked. This was the thing she could not have predicted and could not have described if asked to describe what she wanted in advance of wanting it, and that she recognized now as essential. October arrived and brought with it the smell of change and the first frost on the lower pastures and the very particular energy of a valley preparing for winter, while knowing that this year was different from the last. On a Saturday morning when the sky was pale blue and the aspens on the ridge had gone absolutely gold, Patrick Ralston came to the Merritt homestead in his good coat and his good hat, and he knocked at the front door, which he had never done before. He always came around to the back or the kitchen, the practical doors, the working doors. The front door was for formal occasions. Theodora opened it. She had been expecting something. She had learned to pay attention to the quiet signals of things approaching. He stood on her porch with his hat in his hands, and he looked at her with the steady, warm directness that was so completely himself that she felt the sight of it like something physical. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "I have been thinking about how to do this for 2 months, and I have decided that the most honest way to ask you something is plainly, so I am asking you plainly. I love you. I think you love me. I want to build a life alongside yours, not absorb it, alongside it. Your children are extraordinary, and I would not presume to replace what they had, but I would like, if you'll permit it, to be something real and permanent in their lives. And I want to be with you, Theodora, for as long as there is." He stopped. The autumn air moved between them, carrying a leaf from the cottonwood at the gate across the yard. Theodora looked at him for a moment. She thought of everything, the winter and the fence and the calf and the hay and the notes and the waltz and the porch steps and the cemetery and the September morning and all of it, all the accumulated weight of a year of becoming certain. "Yes," she said. The word came out simple and complete, with none of the conditions she might have attached to it and didn't need to, because he had already shown her, across an entire year, that he understood every condition without being told. He stepped forward and she stepped forward, and he kissed her on the porch of the house she had built with Edgar, in the October morning with the aspens gold on the ridge. And it was its own thing, not a shadow of what had been, not a replacement, but a genuine new beginning conducted by 2 adults who had both learned enough to know what they were doing and why. Henry opened the kitchen door and said, with great satisfaction, "Clara owes me a nickel." They were married in November. A small ceremony in the Cartwell Church on a bright cold day, the valley witnessing with the warm proprietary interest of a community that has watched a story developing and is pleased with the resolution. Martha Gaines cried, which she had apparently planned to do and executed beautifully. Hazel Drummond did not cry but looked intensely satisfied, the expression of a woman who has been right about something and knows it. Dooley and Cass stood in the back in their good clothes, both of them scrubbed to an unusual shine, Cass having apparently borrowed a neckerchief from Dooley for the occasion. Clara was the picture of contained dignity throughout, wearing her good dress and watching everything with the same scientist's attention. She applied to weather and knot tying, and the geography book. Henry lasted through the ceremony with the biscuit she had bribed him with, and afterward appropriated Patrick's hat, which fit him entirely over his eyes, and paraded around the churchyard in it until Dooley retrieved it. The house they decided on, after considerable practical discussion of the kind two ranchers have when they are also falling in love, was the Merritt homestead. Patrick's ranch would continue operating. Dooley and Cass were more than capable of managing the day-to-day, and he would ride north each morning and south each evening, the land of both properties being managed as two separate enterprises that happened to belong to the same family. This had been Theodora's idea, and Patrick had agreed immediately, understanding without her explaining that it was important to her that the Merritt land remain the Merritt land, that the work she had done be its own thing, continuous and acknowledged. The first winter of their marriage was not easy, because winters in Wyoming never are, but it was different in kind. Not because Patrick solved the problems that arose. Theodora solved most of them herself, and he solved the ones that needed two people, and there was no particular accounting of who did what, but because the evenings were different. Because there was someone else breathing in the dark. Because when the cold pressed in at the windows, the kitchen was full of the sound of two people and two children, and a life that was actively being lived. He learned her rhythms and she learned his. She learned that he was not a morning person in the way that some people are not morning people, functional, competent, but operating on reserve power until the second cup of coffee. He learned that she thought best walking, and that when she went for a walk after supper she was not unhappy, she was thinking, and the appropriate response was to either walk with her in companionable quiet or let her walk alone, and she would tell him which if asked directly. These small navigations, made with mutual goodwill and the willingness to ask and answer honestly, became the architecture of their daily life. Clara, in the spring, asked Patrick to teach her to brand cattle, which he did with complete seriousness, explaining the reason for each step while she listened, and then demonstrated back to him what she had retained, which was everything. He came home that evening and said to Theodora, with an expression she had come to love, the expression of a man who has been genuinely impressed by something, "Your daughter is going to run cattle in this territory by the time she is 18, and there will be nothing anyone can do about it." "I know," Theodora said. "Edgar always said the same." "Edgar was right," Patrick said. Henry, meanwhile, had decided that his primary vocation was mechanical, and had spent the spring disassembling and partially reassembling the broken clock that had been sitting in the barn since Edgar bought it from a wagon train family who were lightening their load. Patrick located the relevant manual from a catalog and ordered it from the east, and the afternoon it arrived Henry sat down with the manual and the clock and the careful precision of a boy who has found his thing, and by supper he had it running. "He is 7, Theodora said, looking at the clock on the shelf. 8 next month, Patrick said. He figured it out in 4 hours. She looked at her son, who was now investigating the workings of the butter churn with a speculative expression, and she felt the expansive particular joy of watching your children become themselves. The spring turned into the second summer of their marriage, and the valley was good and the cattle market was strong, and Theodora discovered in May that she was expecting. She told Patrick on a Tuesday morning before the children were up, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, and she watched his face receive the information, first the still moment of comprehension, then the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on him, an expression of happiness so complete and unself-conscious that she felt it like a gift. He reached across the table and took her hand. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Like a woman who has done this before and knows what to expect," she said. "And also like I want crackers." He procured crackers. This was so entirely characteristic that she laughed, right there at the early morning kitchen table, and he laughed with her. And outside, the Wyoming summer was beginning its long golden day. The children received the news with characteristic style. Clara with a measured assessment of the practical implications and a determination to be useful in precisely specified ways. Henry with the observation that they would need a bigger chair at the table, followed by a request to calculate the weight and dimensions of infant chairs, which led to a surprisingly productive conversation about mathematics. The pregnancy progressed well, as Theodora's pregnancies did. She was not someone who was ill, merely someone who was tired in the early months, and then large, and then, on the 22nd of January 1884, delivered, with Patrick in the house and the midwife from town in the bedroom, a boy. A solid, indignant, healthy boy who announced his arrival with a clarity that suggested he had opinions from the very beginning. They named him James Edgar Ralston. The middle name was Theodora's suggestion, and Patrick had looked at her when she said it with the particular expression she had learned to read, as the deepest kind of feeling. He had quiet and full and real. James Edgar was not a quiet baby, but he was a healthy one, and the house in the deep January cold was full of the particular exhausted aliveness of a home with a newborn, the interrupted nights and the warming of small things, and the older children's fascinated attention to this new creature in their midst. Clara appointed herself head of infant supervision and executed this role with the thoroughness one might expect. Henry, after a brief period of scientific investigation into the mechanics of infant crying, including a detailed theory about lung capacity, settled into a genuine affection for his small brother, carrying him with the careful confidence of a boy who has been given a real responsibility and takes it seriously. Theodora nursed and slept and worked as she could and watched her family with the eyes of a woman who has come through a great deal and has not forgotten it, who holds what she has with the care of someone who understands what its absence would cost. Patrick worked the ranch and came home in the evenings and walked with James when he could not sleep, moving through the kitchen in the lamplit night with the baby against his shoulder, and she sometimes woke and lay in the warm dark and listened to the low sound of his voice and thought about the word enough. How she had used it about herself in October of the previous year, how she had meant it then, and how it meant something different and larger now. The months rolled on with the particular texture of a life that has found its shape. There were difficulties. There are always difficulties on the frontier, in the late 1880s in Wyoming territory, with the cattle market fluctuating and the winters unpredictable, and the land making its usual demands. There were hard years and easy ones. Drought in the summer of 1886 that required them to drive the herd further north and cost them 3 animals and a significant portion of that year's profit. There was a dispute with a land surveyor in 1885 that required 2 trips to the county seat and the intervention of a lawyer from Cheyenne before it was resolved in their favor. Through it all there was the particular foundation of 2 people who had learned each other honestly and knew how to navigate difficulty without losing the thread of who they were to each other. They disagreed sometimes. Theodora's method of managing the accounts and Patrick's method of managing the accounts were different enough to constitute genuine philosophical conflict, resolved eventually by a division of responsibilities that took 6 months to negotiate and was thereafter entirely practical. They had the particular arguments of 2 strong-willed people who love each other and are not willing to lose themselves in that love, and those arguments were sometimes sharp and sometimes long and always, eventually, resolved with the honesty that had been the foundation of everything between them since the spring morning in the kitchen garden when she had told him she was still learning. In the spring of 1886, Clara turned 13 and began studying for what Theodora was already calling, with quiet determination, her eventual enrollment in the women's college in Denver that Clara had read about in the geography book, and circled in pencil with the authority of someone noting a future address. Patrick, when told of this plan, said it was an excellent idea and immediately began calculating what they would need to save each year to make it possible. This calculation became a household institution, tracked in a ledger that Clara herself maintained with the precision of a young woman who understands money as a tool for freedom. Henry turned 12 and spent the summer working full-time alongside Dooley and Cass on the northern ranch in a state of complete satisfaction, learning the physical work of cattle ranching with the same systematic thoroughness he applied to everything, but also tinkering with the water pump mechanism on slow afternoons, until Dooley said the pump had never worked so well in 5 years of ownership. James Edgar, at 2 years old, was a personality of such concentrated force that everyone in his vicinity operated with some awareness of him at all times. He had Theodora's directness and Patrick's steady deliberateness, and a laugh that belonged to neither of them. A huge, delighted laugh that rolled out of him without warning, the laugh of a person who finds the world perpetually interesting and does not see any reason to contain that finding. When it came, it made everyone in earshot smile against their will, including Patrick, who would look at his son with the particular expression of a man who has been given something he did not know how to ask for and is still slightly astonished by it. By the fall of 1887, the Ralston properties, both of them, north and south, the merged operation they had never officially merged but ran as a single coordinated enterprise, were producing well. The herd had grown from Patrick's original 60, and Theodora's 8 to a combined operation of over 100 head of quality cattle, managed with the organized efficiency of 2 people who shared the knowledge between them and assigned tasks according to competence rather than convention. Theodora handled the accounts and the planting and the household supply management, and the cattle records with a precision that the county surveyor had once described as the best record-keeping he had encountered in 10 years of doing business in the territory. Patrick handled the physical range management and the market relationships and the coordination of Dooley and Cass and the 2 additional hands they had taken on as the herd grew. It worked because they had built it to work, with the same deliberate honesty they had applied to everything else. On an evening in October of 1887, 5 years to the month after Edgar Merritt's funeral, Theodora sat on the porch in the autumn dark. James Edgar was asleep. Henry was doing schoolwork at the kitchen table. Clara was reading in her room, a novel she had borrowed from the schoolteacher. The same schoolteacher who had survived her blizzard and was still there, was now Cartwell's institution, who had developed a lending library from her own collection that served the valley with a generosity that had earned her a status equivalent to the Reverend's. Patrick came out of the house and sat beside her. Not on separate chairs on the top porch step, as they had started doing on August evenings in the summer of their courtship and had never quite stopped, because the step put them at the same height and closed together, and that had always felt right. "It's been a year almost," he said. She knew what he meant. He meant 5 years, not 1-5. He meant Edgar. She leaned into him. His arm came around her. The valley was dark and deep around them, the mountains a black mass against the star-heavy sky, the creek running low now in the dry autumn, its sound smaller than in spring. "I was thinking about the cornmeal," she said. He laughed softly. "You are always thinking about the cornmeal." "It changed things," she said. "The fact that you took it back, I have thought about it more than I can count." "What about it?" he said. She considered. "I think it was the moment I started learning something important," she said. "Not just about whether I could manage, about what kind of man you were, that you would give me the chance to refuse when it would have been easier and more satisfying to your own conscience to simply leave it." He was quiet. The night moved around them. "I wanted to help you," he said. "God knows I wanted to help you." That whole winter I wanted to come over and fix everything, and I kept riding past and looking at what you were managing and telling myself to stay on my side of the fence." "Why did you?" she said. "Because," he said slowly, finding it as he spoke, "because you were building something that was yours. And I understood. I think I understood from the very first time you looked at me at the fence when you were digging that post and told me you believed you could manage. I understood that this was not about the fence, that you were deciding who you were going to be. And that if I stepped in and took that decision away from you, even with the best of intentions, I would be taking something you could never get back." She pressed closer to him, there on the step in the October night. "You were right," she said. "You were magnificent," he said simply. "That whole winter, magnificent and stubborn and correct." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I love you, Patrick. I love you," he said. They sat there in the dark, on the step of the house that was hers and had always been hers and was also now theirs. And the valley spread around them in the Wyoming night with its mountains and its creek and its history and its future. And it was, as it had been, and would continue to be enough. More than enough. The particular, hard-won, specific abundance of a life chosen deliberately and built honestly and shared between two people who had learned, at some cost and with great care, how to stand fully in themselves before they reached for each other. Inside, Henry was adding a column of figures. Clara was turning a page. James Edgar was dreaming whatever enormous, laughing dreams 2-year-olds dream. The stove was warm. The cattle were settled in the lower pasture. The north fence held, as it had held for 5 years, as she had made it hold in those cold October days when she was still learning. Outside, the stars over Wyoming were the particular absolute density of stars over country, where no city light diminishes them, millions of them. Impossible and real. The same stars that had watched the valley through every winter it had ever endured, every spring it had ever delivered, every life it had ever shaped. Theodora looked up at them from her husband's shoulder and thought of everything. The weight of loss and the weight of work, and the specific gravity of a woman who decides to become herself and does it, and then finds, on the other side of that becoming, that the world is larger than she thought, and there is room in it for more than she had dared to want. She thought about the first morning of the previous November, 2 years into this marriage, when she had gone out to find that Patrick had already fixed the water pump before she woke, and she had felt not the resentment of someone whose agency has been usurped, but the warmth of someone who is looked after by a person who knows the difference between looking after and taking over. And she had stood in the yard in the cold with her coffee, and felt something that she had only lately found a word for. A word she had been circling for a long time, content, not resigned, not settled, not making do, content. In the full, earned, specific meaning of a word that is only real when it has been paid for. She thought about Clara's future in Denver and Henry's future in this valley or somewhere else of his own choosing, and James Edgar's enormous laughing unknown future, and Patrick beside her on the porch step in the dark, breathing steadily, his arm around her, as solid and real as the mountain at the western edge of her sight. She thought about a woman who had asked for nothing all winter and a man who had understood why, and a spring conversation in a kitchen garden when she said I was still learning and meant it, and everything that had grown from that. "Should we go in?" he said, eventually. The night had deepened around them. "In a minute," she said. He held her without hurry. The creek ran in the dark, the stars burned overhead, the house behind them breathed with the living warmth of their family inside it, and there was no need for this last quiet minute for anything at all beyond this. Beyond the porch step in the October night and the two of them exactly where they were. Then she said, "All right, let's go in." They went inside together, and the door closed behind them, and the lamp in the window burned on for a while against the Wyoming dark. And then that too went out, and the valley was quiet, and it was good.